This is the Doc and Krueger cast, the official podcast of Doc and Krueger Games. Season 1, Episode 11, regarding dice. Hello friends, and welcome to another episode of the Doc and Krueger cast. I'm Chris Krueger, and I'm joined today by Adam Doc Brackin.
Hey everybody.
And today we're talking about dice. This is obviously a very broad topic in the world of tabletop RPGs, but what we're going to be sort of going over is to sort of follow up a little bit on our last episode. We were talking about, roleplay for roleplay. Why use dice? When do you use dice? And then even beyond that, what do different dice systems mean to your game?
It's such a dicey topic.
It is a dicey topic. So I guess probably the place to start off, I think, is when to roll. And this is, like I said, related to our talk last week.
Yeah.
To possibly misquote, and to paraphrase, certainly, from Burning Wheel, which is a system that's had a big influence on us as designers.
Yes, indeed.
We have written down here, don't roll unless you have to.
Yeah.
I think also that book might have said, like, ignore these rules. Like it sort of took you through the entire system and how the rules work, and then just sort of said at the end, ignore the rules.
Oh, by the way, ignore these. Yeah.
And I think the philosophy there, of course, is not necessarily like ignore them, but to use them when you ought to. Yeah. And to ignore them when you ought not to.
Well, and as a shout out to the brilliant design, which is in the Burning Wheel system, especially the gold edition, I would say that there's alternates. There's alternative versions of mechanics. Like you've got the simple fight mechanic, right. You've got the more complex fight mechanic. And whenever you've got that moment where you really want to say, let's abstract this out, there's that quote again, you can simply pull out the simple fight mechanics. Everybody rolls one thing, and then you compare, and it's still in the book, and it's still legit, and it still fits in with everything else. It's just, it's not going to be 40 minutes for the fight.
And to paraphrase another game that is a big influence on us that I think I mentioned in a previous episode, the Powered by the Apocalypse systems, games like Apocalypse World and Dungeon World and others, say basically to only bring in the rules, to basically ignore the rules and just tell a story until the story triggers a move that's listed in the rules. And at that point, you then look at the mechanics and decide how things are resolved and stuff like that.
Yeah.
But the important thing being that you're not sort of saying, hey, I've gotten to a place where I want to go ahead and see, do I succeed? You just sort of assume that everything is a yes until the GM says, hang on, let's introduce a complication here. And then that's when you roll to see what happens.
So in some systems, you can steer towards the roll. You can declare that you want to roll. And in other systems, you just kind of go along until you need to roll.
Right.
And goodness, we've played whole sessions where we never rolled a single die.
Right.
In fact, as I recall, the first episode of Lucky Strike, Camp Lucky Strike, we didn't roll a single die.
Nope.
Not one. And that's kind of evident actually in that if you listen to it with that in mind, that even though we were using a very specific system, Tales from the Wild Blue Yonder, we didn't need to do beyond thinking, okay, this is who that character is, and I've got this idea, because we used Premade Characters for that even. And it was so good. It was so good.
And also Kevin, our GM, had a very sort of particular adventure hook in mind.
He did.
And so he was kind of guiding us through, here is what's going to happen. And like he even, and we didn't mind this ourselves because we trust him as a GM, and we play with him a lot. So we have a good chemistry. So some players might object to being told, here's what you do, or here's what you think. Right. But we came into this actually with prefabbed characters. He provided these characters and we added our own flavor to them, of course. And the keys, and this is, we'll go into this more in a future episode. The keys in Tales from the Wild Blue Yonder help to kind of direct the way in which you are encouraged to play your character.
Right.
And so that played into it as well. But, he was kind of giving us some guidance to get us into, here's the mindset that this character would probably have. And then we took it from there.
Exactly. So the answer to your question is, when should you roll dice? And the answer is when you need to, or when you want to.
Yeah. And I would maybe twist that a little bit, and to say, and to maybe make it a little bit more specific, would be to say roll when failure is meaningful.
Ooh, good call.
Or maybe put it a different way is to make it is roll when it would actually be interesting.
Yeah.
When failure is interesting. So for example, the quick fight versus the long fight and Burning Wheel.
Right.
If you've established that your character is an experienced soldier or, like a vigilante who's had a lot of experience in fighting people and taking people down, or like with street fighting specifically, that sort of thing. And you run into just like random thugs, you could probably take them on with no problem. And so that's a case where if in your story you've kind of figured that like these guys are schmucks and they're not going to pose any threat to me, you could just say, hand wave it. Yeah, you beat them down, describe how.
Nice. Yeah.
You could also say that like, no, I want there to be a little bit of threat here, but your odds of winning are so incredibly high that you probably don't need to worry about it. Then the GM might say, okay, let's do the quick fight rules. Just like really quickly, let's do like a quick comparative roll. You win, describe what happens.
Right.
And then saving the really intense fight potentially for something that's actually meaningful, like someone you're going up against to where it's actually evenly matched, or it's crucial to the story. Like, you're finally fighting the guy who killed your father, prepare to die.
Right.
And you're having that big epic duel and you actually want to play it out moment for moment. The other thought would be that like, maybe that same group of thugs that you run into, the GM says, no, we're actually going to do a full fight for this because your character isn't established as being a legendary fighter, could easily take them down. Or you're playing in a more realistic setting where even if you do have this experience, being outnumbered and fighting people who aren't going to fight fair makes it actually very threatening. And so you actually want to say that in my system, or in this world, I should say, in this campaign, it's important that we actually play this out to show that everything is a threat.
Yeah. And there's some other ways you can tweak that too. Like, for example, you start a game and you're running across the rooftops. It's raining. You're being chased. The bad guys are after you, or maybe you're after them. You're running across the rooftops. You jump, roll to jump. Okay. So we actually had a session that began that way. We knew nothing about what was going on. It was in medias res, to use the term, in the middle of things is what that means. Now, to roll to jump for that moment, if you do a certain way, you failed that roll. Okay, your character falls to his death. In the first scene? No, that's not going to happen. What you can do in that moment as the GM is you can say, roll to see how well you land your roll. So it's a given that you're going to jump from rooftop to rooftop.
Right.
But are you going to do that not stealthily, but swiftly and with great grace and keep pace with the people that you're chasing? Or are you going to be able to outrun the ones that are chasing you? Or are you going to fall flat on your face and skid and maybe even hurt yourself? Are you going to dangle from your fingertips? It's not about imminent death at that moment. It's about how you're going to narrate it. And that plays into the sort of the way that you do a story-driven game. It's not about character death. It's never about character death. It's about character cool, if you will, So anyway.
Or complication.
Or complication. There you go. That's a great way to say it. So all of that then leads into the actual dice mechanics themselves, which I think we need to talk about.
Yeah. The way that you designed the use of dice in your system, actually, it's a very common question you'll find among mainstream role players, and which is actually, I've heard some people discuss before how it might be a little bit frustrating sometimes to have people ask what system is this in when they're pitching a game, when in fact, like what they're really talking about is like, no, this game is about this theme or this sort of story or this sort of experience.
So true.
And it's maybe a custom system, and having to explain to someone. So like, okay, so it's a custom system built around this idea. And then you have to like explain like how everything works.
Right.
Some people like kind of the shorthand of like, it's D20. It's fudge.
It's D6.
Yeah. Whatever the case might be.
Yeah.
And that's because, there are some systems that have been sort of like tried and tested over time, and people find that they like playing in this system more than this one for this reason or that reason, or they understand the differences between them mechanically, and they can say, oh yeah, the setting you're describing, and you say that this is using that dice system, that works really well. I can see how that could work. That sort of thing. But, the example, Doc, that, you and I have given before as part of a presentation to middle schoolers about kind of like a little bit of an introduction to game design and how to think about this, was in tabletop role-playing games, the idea of, for example, a flat probability curve versus a bell curve.
Right.
That when you have, say, a Dungeons and Dragons, which is a D20 system, and of course they don't only use single D20. They have other things
modifiers and things. But you mean the dice types? Yes. That's usually for damage, though.
Yeah.
Whenever you're rolling for an ability, it's almost always D20. Right. And it's fundamentally a D20 system. Yeah.
And they build into that, kind of the idea of like, if you roll a natural 1 or natural 20, what they mean by natural in that case is that regardless of whether you have a modifier, if the die itself lands on either a 1 or 20, then that's a natural.
Which of course means you have a 1 in 20 success or chance of success at anything you try to do, no matter what.
Just about, yeah. Kind of like critical success versus I think they call it a fumble in D&D.
Yeah.
And that has very specific mechanical implications.
Yes, it does.
And then by extension, narrative potentially.
Of course.
But yeah, it's basically like a D20 plus a modifier, which is to say there's a set obstacle number. Sometimes the GM will declare it. Sometimes they have a number in their head that you're trying to beat or not beat.
Or it's in the scenario in the book.
Right. Yep.
Yeah.
But basically, say the obstacle here is a 15, which is something relatively difficult.
Yeah.
And then you've got like a +5 in this skill. And so you roll your D20 and it lands on a 12. You add your 5, that gets you a 17. You beat the obstacle, and you succeed at the action. And basically you would narrate that, and depending on maybe like, how big of the gap was, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
You might narrate it differently.
Ultimately, though, everything you just said was linear probability.
Exactly. And so because you're rolling just a single die, you've got a 1 in 20 chance of getting any given number on that face.
Right.
And then you can sort of translate that a little bit into, okay, so given that the obstacle is a 15, I could say that, I have a % chance of beating that number given my modifier.
Right.
Because my range is anywhere between 6 and 25.
Right.
And so you sort of look at where 15 falls in that. You can say, okay, I'm not going to do the math in my head at the moment, but I've got, X number chance that I'm going to roll above that, X number chance to roll below. And then players can, depending if they want to, or whether the GM's kind of forcing them to roll, so to speak, determine if they want to take the chance on something.
Yes. And, unmodified, there is a trap here for designers, potentially. I used to teach this stuff, and you actually helped co-teach with me the history and development of the role-playing game a couple of semesters. And in doing that, one of the things that we always stressed to the students was, if you're saying that a success happens on a 6+ on a D10, which is a 10-sided die, or a 11+ on a D20, you might as well just flip a coin.
Right.
It's still 50-50. So unless you're modifying it. Now, if it's a +1 modifier to a D6, that's different than a +1 modifier to a D20. And that's very extreme. And so you need to think about those numbers and the math that goes into the system at that level. But still, everything that we've just said, all of that is still linear probability. So let's talk about that bell curve you mentioned.
Right. And so as soon as you have 2 or more dice that you're rolling, you are, generally speaking, assuming the system says this, which by and large is the case, that you're combining the 2 results on the dice and using the sum to be your result number.
Right.
And like I said, with 2 or more dice, it's always going to have a bell curve. It's going to have a higher probability of getting the number that's, I think, the median, right in the middle, or maybe the 2 if it works out that way.
It normalizes the average, basically.
And then the odds of getting the minimum result and the maximum results are comparatively very, very low.
Yes.
And so that's why they call it a bell curve, is because the curve, if you go from left to right on the results and the probability chance of it happening, starts off low, gets higher, and then goes back down.
Just like getting an A in my class.
Yes.
No, that's not right. But the interesting thing about that then is the more dice you add to that when you roll, actually, as long as you're adding them together, then the more extreme the results get. So the chance of getting a 2 on 2d6 is a lot better than the chance of getting a 3 on 3d6. But or an 18 for that matter. And yet the chance of getting a 20 on a D20, or an 18 for that matter, is actually so much higher than getting an 18 on 3d6.
Right.
So when you use these systems just sort of arbitrarily, these dice systems arbitrarily, you're making a terrible mistake if you don't think through how normal it's going to feel for someone to keep rolling that 7 consistently. If you've ever played Settlers of Catan or anything in the Catan series, you know exactly what I'm talking about when you get that piece of land that's a 2 and the piece of land that's a 12 versus the one that's the 8 or the 6. The 6 keeps coming up. The 8 keeps coming up. The 7 comes up all the time.
Because those are closer to the median.
Yeah, and that's a game that understands probability. And it's if you understand probability, you'll win, frankly. On that same note, one of my absolute favorite role-play systems of all time ever is Mean Streets. It's actually kind of hard to find, but it's PDF only. About 15 years ago, it came out. There was a bunch of expansions to it, but you can find it if you search around. And one of the things I loved about it is that it was noir, like old school noir. It wasn't sci-fi noir or anything like that, though I've run that in it.
You're talking like 1940s.
Yeah, it was 1940s, 50s, 60s. Yeah, all that, classic film noir, gangster type stuff. You could play a beat cop or a detective, do a hard-boiled, gritty, this and that. And the great thing about it is most of your rolls, because it's 2d6, are going to be average. And that's exactly what the theme of noir is. It's about being average. And so if you really understand the mechanics and the math behind choosing your die, you can actually really have this tone and feel come through in every single roll. Even if your players never fully grasp it, it's going to be ingrained deeply into it. What are some other mechanics that we could talk about in that regard that sort of reflect the system?
Fudge dice is a good example.
Oh, great example.
Fate dice. Fate, of course, being, I think Fudge, when it was released released under kind of like an open games license.
Yeah, it was.
I don't know if it's technically OGL because that's like a D20 thing.
True.
But the idea being that it was released as a feel free to modify and republish this however you want. And so Fate, as we know at Fate Core, a very popular sort of story-driven system, is ultimately derived from Fudge. And the way that these dice work is it's basically a 6-sided die, but on 2 of the faces they have a plus, on 2 of the faces it's a blank, and on 2 of the faces it's a minus.
We would also call that a D3, but that doesn't exist in physics. So,
and you can also do the same thing. It's technically a little bit different, but you can approximate by saying that, like 1 through 2 is a minus, 3 through 4 is a blank, 5 through 6.
You can just, any D6 you can do it as long as you are consistent.
If you're consistent, that's, I think, the most important thing. Some people actually try to simulate a little bit more closely, and I forget the numbers, but they give you specific faces that have to be pluses and blanks and minuses, because the way the Fudge dice are laid out, you're trying to match it as closely as possible to that. Yeah. But for all intents and purposes, it's a third chance on each die of getting either a plus or a blank or a minus.
Right.
And what will happen is in one of these games, they kind of have a modifier for your skill that might be plus or minus, whatever. And then you basically start at that number, and then you basically add however many pluses or minuses, and they all cancel out typically. So if you roll, say two Fudge dice, 2 Fate dice, we'll just call them DF. If you roll 2 DF, and one's a plus and one's a minus, the net result is 0.
Nothing.
If you roll 2 pluses, it's +2. If you roll a blank and a plus, it's +1, et cetera, et cetera. And so these are just kind of like, when you roll for something, you have a plus minus range that's possible for that roll based on your skill.
Exactly.
And the Fate Core system, I love its elegance and the way it does things, because usually there might be an obstacle or something like that you're trying to beat, but also they have this sort of ladder of result. And I forget off the top of my head what some of the numbers are, but like getting a +2 is not so impressive as getting a +9. Like a +9 is just like this legendary, crazy, and unforgettable,
statistically improbable.
Yes, very statistically improbable.
I mean, if you actually run the numbers on the chances of doing that, based on the D3s, which is how you do that math, oh my goodness, that if you run a game for months, you're extremely unlikely to see that result ever. Yeah, just ever.
And then there are ways typically to, we talked a little bit before about story games and how they'll reward you for role play. And so for role playing your character role, you get extra fate points, and then those fate points can be spent to get you extra dice that you add to your roll, that sort of thing. So usually you've got or maybe not even extra dice. I think it will allow for re-rolls or allow for you to sort of add to the results of whatever you get. But that's another one where you kind of have a bell curve that is around kind of like a central point. You can kind of predictably say that I'm going to land somewhere around here.
Yes.
And the GM can also sort of balance the difficulty of certain tasks or obstacles or whatever, challenges or obstacles, based on where they can expect you to be in that skill. And that also still emphasizes the importance of skills. We didn't really get into the definition of why role play is called what it is. It's not just role playing as in the sense of I'm playing my character and we're having a conversation in character. It's also I'm playing this role in the party. That's kind of almost the more traditional definition. You can have role playing games that might not have any actual role play and character stuff, but it's still the role playing game because it's I'm filling this role in the party.
Right. damage dealer, tank. Those are the healer. Those are traditional kind of. Yeah, exactly. It's funny. What you just said reminds me of Burning Wheel for a different reason, and it's having to do with shade shifting, which is a mechanic there. And mostly it comes in character creation, but whenever you're creating your character, you can spend creation points to shade shift. And what you're sacrificing is the number of dice that you get to roll, which is a very good thing in that system, for being able to count 3s, 4s, 5s, and 6s as successes. And if you shade shift again, which is incredibly expensive, you shift from black to gray to white. Whenever you finally become Gandalf the White, which is the inspiration here, 2s, 3s, 4s, 5s, and 6s. So only 1s don't count.
Right.
You're basically almost guaranteed to succeed, but you'd be very limited in the number of dice that you would be able to roll, probably, unless you spent over a year getting that character to that point. Now we've seen that happen.
We've played in those campaigns,
and it, we had an unstoppable wizard, and Mare the Blue was legendary. But I think whenever you start talking in those terms about, do I want more dice or do I want more powerful dice? That is, I think, at the core of a design decision. First of all, as the designer of the system, are you going to make that sort of a decision part of the system, or are you going to hand it off to the player to decide whether or not they want it to be a part of their character? Do you see what I'm saying? So having the capacity to adjust not just the types of dice or the numbers of dice or the effectiveness of dice in the system as a core system dictated, is actually different from being able to say, okay, player, when you're creating your character, do you want option A or do you want option B? Because you can make those decisions, and so I love, as long as it's an informed decision, I love being able to give those decisions to the players, like handing them the toolbox and saying, here, help co-design this with me, make some effective mechanics decisions for your character. And that's super interesting to me. I almost personally prefer to have a character who has a base modifier that's high, and then you roll like a D4 or a D6, instead of a character who has a D20.
It's the difference in variance. And I think that sort of plays into what you're trying to accomplish with your game, what you're trying to accomplish with your system. The idea of how big of a swing do I want people to be able to experience, if that makes sense. So if you can pretty reliably, like Mean Streets, I think, is the system that does this really well. Fate's the system that does this pretty well, among others. D&D, if it's well balanced, can do this. Where you can sort of go into it knowing, generally speaking, I'm going to get this range of results. And it's a fairly small range. And so I know if we are working on an obstacle-based system, which, is sometimes the case, sometimes not, but we won't go into that right now. If my obstacle is 20, then can I ever hit 20? Or do I need to be better skilled at this in order to be able to hit 20?
Right.
Or does the system say, like, there's a chance that you can succeed at anything you try?
Yeah.
And there's some, like, D&D is a system that will sometimes let you do that with the natural 20.
The nat 20, yeah.
There's some systems that, like, just sort of build into the dice mechanics saying that, like, there's always a chance that you will succeed at something.
Yeah.
And sometimes they do that by saying it's not obstacle based. It's perhaps, in a later version of the same series as Lady Blackbird. Lady Blackbird had a slightly different dice mechanic than the second two games.
Yes, it did.
And in the first one, it was actually obstacle based. And the second one, it's basically just like the size of your dice pool. The bigger the size of the dice pool gives you a better chance at getting a bigger and better results. But there's always at least a 50% chance that you won't fail.
Right.
And so that's kind of like, you have to think about what it is you're trying to accomplish with the game.
Yeah.
If you want some things to actually be impossible for characters that aren't trained in it, then you might go with a more, like, set high obstacles and make the stat very important to getting you to the place where you can get up that high. Whereas if you want something where, it's more high flying action and it's like everyone's very competent and that's just kind of understood.
Yes.
You might go with something where people more often will succeed.
I also enjoy a system that has what we might consider spread involved in it. Now, the idea behind this is simply, let's say your obstacle for your roll is a 10, and through whatever mechanics, you roll a 6. That's your result. And at the end of it, what you've ended up with is a failure because you did not reach 10, but you've missed the 10 by 4. And so what does the 4 symbolize? Oh, well, the 4 symbolizes that you missed it pretty bad.
Yeah.
Or it's a normal miss. So I love a system that allows you then to go like, that is a devastating failure. You've shot yourself in the foot. You have a new complication. Or, okay, yeah, you just failed, but beyond the failure, nothing bad happens. Or like a near miss kind of a situation where it's like, okay, you came really, really close. So you get a benefit, something good happens, but not quite. And it can go the other way too. Did you succeed? Did you gloriously succeed? Or did you just normal succeed? You know, and then that plays into the narrative of it. I think that the Star Wars system does that very well. The Fantasy Flight Star Wars system does that very well with advantages and disadvantages, and then also failures and successes.
Yeah, we didn't even talk about the way that dice system works because
that's specialty dice. Yeah, and there's lots of systems out there with specialty dice, and Fantasy Flight kind of has corners the market on that, I should say. Like, I've lost it. Warhammer Fantasy is an example of that. One of the early examples of specialty dice and how that works. But anything that has the word Star Wars on it and Fantasy Flight is going to have that sort of special die mechanic that's special to the game. And I love the way they did that. The old Doom game did that, and Descent did that, and that kind of a thing. But when you really get down to it, I think that there's got to be reasons for the dice you choose.
Right.
Now, one of my favorite systems out there is just what I would call a dice pool system that uses lots of different die types. The Serenity game actually used this. I think it was actually Firefly originally. And then,
no, it was Serenity originally, and then eventually they were able to make Firefly.
Right, they reprinted it as Firefly. That's right, because Serenity was based on the movie, and Firefly was based on the series. Technically,
Firefly might have also been Cortex Plus.
It was Cortex Plus. That's true. But what it really came down to for me was when I leveled up a skill, I could go from a D4 to a D6 to a D8 to a D10 to a D12. And that just felt so meaningful to me when I have this big handful of dice and I can just build and I can buy and I can do, and then I just go crash and all of these things. Now, what the problem with that is that if you are looking for successes, or if you are adding them up, or if you're doing these other things, the game can potentially grind to a halt. So you do math. And this goes for any system. I'm not picking on Cortex.
Shadowrun's kind of notorious for having just like these giant like bowls full of D6s.
Bowls full of D6s, right? It's like suddenly you're playing Warhammer 40K with orcs. You've got bowls full of dice. And there's so many different ways to handle that. A stat, for example, might mean, let's say my stat is 6. Well, what does that mean? Does that mean that you need to roll a die and get better than a 6? Does that stat mean that you're going to roll a die and add 6?
And then beat an obstacle?
Right. Does that stat mean that you're going to add your skill, whatever that is? Let's say your skill is a 2 for persuasion, and you're going to put your intelligence in there. And so you've got now the 6 plus the 2, and that's an 8. And so that's what we'd call like a derived stat or and there's all these different other ways you can look at it.
Or does the 6 mean you roll 6 dice?
Right. Or does this, and that's where I was leading with all of that. I'm glad you said it though, because I think I might have forgotten to say it if you hadn't said it. It got away from me. And that's exactly what happens. I think in the moment it gets away from us too. We can over design these things to a point where it's like, this is such a great system, and from a design standpoint, when we're entrenched in it as designers, we're like, well, it's so simple. All you have to do is take this is the number, and then you add this, and then you subtract your modifiers, and then you average that out, and then the GM will compare that to theirs, and then you'll deal damage. And I'm just like, you've lost me, especially as a new RPG gamer. Back in the day, I was trying to dive into this stuff, and I remember it was a D20 variant. It was called Jeremiah. It was my very first system. It was based on a TV show called Jeremiah, which in and of itself was kind of fun. Post-apocalyptic, whatever. But it was D20. And they said, so after you've rolled your characters, this is how you assign the stats. And I was like, what do you mean roll the where? I can't find that. I had to call a buddy up and be like, this game says roll a character. I don't know what that means. What does that mean? And they literally forgot to put that part in because it was D20. And they were like, okay, so everybody knows what that means because it's D20. Okay. Example 2, another one of my favorite systems, the Grim system, originally was D20, and it was just a little supplement. It was a thin little book. And then a few years later, they reprinted it as what I'll call a D6 dice pool. And whenever they did that, they retooled the entire thing. It was more than just lore, and it was more than just slapped onto a D20. The mechanics were adjusted fundamentally because Grimm is about being little kids in the fairy tale world. And it actually accommodates large groups very, very well. I played with 7 players when I ran it, which that is a nightmare if you've ever played a game with 7 players, except here it wasn't, because when somebody's doing a thing, the other players at the table who want to help physically hand them one of their D6s, and that represents it. And by the end of it, what you end up with is that handful of dice, and you roll it. And what's so cool about it is, in that system, like if you want to say knock a giant down, there is literally mathematically no possible way for an individual character to do that. You are a little kid, he's a giant. You can't. But if you mob him, you can acquire enough D6s to be able to do it. And basically the visual on that in the system is you're grabbing him by the ankle, but then player 2 is behind you and grabbed your belt. And then the player behind that, she's also grabbed your belt, and everybody's pulling all at once, and they trip the giant and bring him down to his face. And then once he's on his face, you attack him, right? And that's so represented in that core dice mechanic that a D20 roll shoehorned in never was. And to me, that is the holy grail moment of finding the right mechanic for the story type and the genre type and the world and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Whew.
Yeah, and I think to that point, the usability is also an important thing. Like you mentioned how sometimes the learning curve can be steeper with some games than with others.
Terrible.
And sometimes that's okay if you're willing to sort of like put in the time to learn it and then like kind of reap the benefits of having it be a very deep and robust and like, you know, a system that can last you years and years.
If you're planning on playing for years and years and your GM knows it,
Yeah.
I absolutely agree.
Whereas there's a philosophy now with like, you know, kind of the indie sort of story driven stuff. They try to make it as sort of as accessible as possible. And if you ever have a more complicated mechanic, usually it's something that's like meant to be used once in a while,
Right.
Usually at a very crucial moment, one that's really going to like decide, like basically in a sense you can say like the harder it is to stop and make this happen, the more important it ought to be, or maybe
well
vice
said.
versa. Where like if we're actually going to take the time to figure out, you know, kind of going back to the beginning when we were talking about like the fight scene, is it important to the story that the fight scene be played out move by move?
Yeah.
To decide like you want to have as much control as possible and make choices moment to moment, or are we okay with just saying this isn't that important? Just do a quick little roll, compare. And, you know, the thing is too, that like the more rolls you have in a process, the more more points of failure, but also those points of failure potentially mean less.
Yes.
Because you could fail a dice roll and it just means I lose 3 HP instead of I lose the fight.
Yes.
And so like we've been saying this whole time, you have to think about what you're using these dice rolls for and when.
Yeah. Well, and I think it's super important to understand that there's certain things you should never be able to accomplish with a single dice roll. You know, Harry Potter is teleported over to where Lord Voldemort is being reborn, and he decides that he's going to cast a spell and kill him. Okay, roll it. He rolls the 20. Oh, well, Voldemort's dead.
Yeah.
End of story. Good job.
Or I
never, ever. And that's the equal and opposite of the Indiana Jones pulling out his pistol and shooting. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. You know, another example, like I want to just leap to the moon from where I'm standing.
Yeah. Roll it.
Yeah, roll it. I rolled a 20, I leapt to the moon. It's like, well, no, you see in this world, escape velocity is very, very high.
Exactly.
And there's no way you could possibly jump unless maybe like part of the story is like this a world with magic in it, and you have to go through this big process in order to acquire and then perform this extremely difficult spell that will teleport you to the moon. And then when you get there, does our moon have atmosphere, or does it not? Because it's like, cool, you're on the moon and you're dead.
Yeah.
So it kind of just depends on the rules of the world, the story you're trying to tell.
Established rules of a world that makes sense. I think really, really important idea.
And that's when the GM kind of being the one to finally rule on those things. They're kind of the authority on the world, and the players to a certain extent having some common sense and playing along, understanding kind of like what's possible, what's reasonable. But of course also like your story is about, if it's Baron Munchausen and I leapt to the moon, and that's not challenged, then I leapt to the moon.
Right. So and it makes sense in that world to do that kind of a thing. So yeah, I think the takeaway here is simple. If you're going to design a system, or if you're going to pick a system, make sure that it fits the narrative and the feel and the tone of the type of interactive story that you are bringing to the table. And a well-designed system is going to do that for you. And a badly designed one is going to limit you from it. And I think the reality is most systems out there are probably somewhere in between. Yeah.
And some people can take a system that might not be great for a purpose and manage to run it such that it becomes amazing at that.
Yeah.
Some people take a game that was designed for a very particular purpose and somehow manage to make it terrible at it.
That's very true.
So it really does come down, I think, a lot to how the player uses these tools, to kind of use that phrase again. And I think that's part of the magic of tabletop RPGs, is that they're so flexible.
Yeah.
It's not like a video game where it's going to play exactly this way because that's how it's programmed to play. A lot of it does come down to kind of the player's application.
Yeah, and that human factor in the GM being able to say, you know what, we're just going to ignore this rule for right now because it's going to slow us down. Moving on.
Exactly. Well, thank you everyone for joining us for our discussion on dice and all that entails. I'm Chris.
I'm Doc.
And we'll see you next time. The Doc and Krueger cast is a production of Doc and Krueger Games, jointly hosted by Adam Doc Brackin and Chris Krueger. The theme music was composed by Nick Krueger. The Roll With It system is available now. You can find it and our other games through our website, docandkrueger.com.